Well, good afternoon. I'm Bill Sweeney,
And I'm Bill Kirlin-Hackett.
and our session today, the title that's up on the screen, The Stones Would Shout. And we're talking about faith-based SafeLot hosting. I don't know, Bill, if you want to comment, I think you were the one who picked the title.
Sure. And I think it's good to have a title to distinguish us from the prior workshop. We really want to keep the fact that we're discussing faith-based communities, um, doing something out in the world front and center. The Stones Would Shout came from a book I wrote a couple of years ago. It's about if these were silent, the Stones would shout. And I feel that way a lot about homelessness, that there's too much silence and there's not enough shouting. So I held this as a possible title, and Bill Sweeney not only loved it, as you will see on other slides, he took it to the next level with other scriptural comments. And we don't mean to just pick out on Christian ones, but it could be from any source. We're talking about faith-based, all faith descriptions as people serve in the world. So that's how we came up with this. And I guess more important, how we make use of our assets.
I think that's good. And I think, Bill, maybe it would be appropriate at this point if each of us gave a little thumbnail biography as to why we chose to be up here.
Yeah, go for it.
Sure. So my background, spent a long time in corporate kind of things, half a century. And about 15 years ago, I switched roles and I have little to do with the corporate role now. And what had been my volunteer role has become my calling. So I've been working with various ways of doing hosting on congregational property almost always. Yeah, those of you who saw the session on how to start a safe lot a few minutes ago, I, like Graham and Linda, am a board member of Colorado Safe Parking. But I have, long before I helped to found that, I was doing various hosting programs and a variety of models. I think altogether I've worked with well over 40 congregations over the last 15 years. Some have had long successful programs that have gone 12, 13 years now. Others
Hmm.
had programs that lasted a single season, but I've seen quite a few different ways to do this work, but always on the context of congregational property.
Hmm. Great. And I'm clergy. I've been at this 39 years. I really only came to safe parking in 2011 when the city of Seattle passed an ordinance called scofflaw. And we've had a lot of people living on the streets. Graham has probably mentioned that a few times during the course of this summit. And one of the things that transpired was a boot on a vehicle if you had too many tickets. They made no mitigation for people living in vehicles. So a colleague of mine, interestingly, who is, I guess I would have called her a cosmic atheist, and I started this scofflaw program. And we got the help of the mayor enough to have parking enforcement and the court on our side. And I'd say for 9 or 10 years, people who got a boot and were in a vehicle or were boot eligible did not get impounded in Seattle. The pandemic threw a wrench into that, and subsequent administrations have thrown a wrench into it. But the wonderful part of it was we got time to do outreach without worrying about an impound. So basically, when I had been doing education and advocacy, I pretty much turned it over to direct service and couldn't give up the advocacy because the powers that be need um, people knocking on their doors. And we won't probably talk as much about that in this session because we're talking about faith communities. So um, I'm trying to get out of this, but it's very hard because everybody in King County has my phone number. So um, it's a blessing and a curse at the same time. So And I'm so glad that we're having this summit and that more of you will consider this. And I'm very impressed to find out more about Colorado and other places um, as we do this. So I think we're ready to talk about that congregations are uniquely positioned to host vehicles, which would be our next slide. And I think some of that's obvious and it's not always obvious. I'll just start this here in our area, congregations in the urban area often don't have very much of a parking space. In the suburbs, like you heard about Bellevue and some others, they're required to have parking because the fire department measures how many seats to how many parking spaces there are. But the reality is that most congregations are where people who are homeless are. So I don't know, Bill, you want to add something to that as I kick that off?
Yeah, I do. And I think this will be a segue into what follows. One of the interesting things is that my experience has been if you have a small committee of people who are really, really interested in doing this and they can see that their parking lot is available and they want to get started, people are needing this right away. That is probably going to, if you simply go with that momentum, that is probably going to be a really rough startup at best. Um,
Mhm.
there's a great deal of difference between working with a congregation and working as a secular provider. I also work with secular providers. And there's a great deal of difference between the two. And one of them is that secular providers really have to think about talking to the whole community, the whole township, the whole county in some way, to the politicians and so forth, to get a decision. Congregations have a similar process, but my experience has been that very stable programs are built when the whole congregation has gone through a discernment process, which seems like it takes a long time. And in my experience, it can take anywhere from 3 to 9 months. But once you get to the end of that, and you have the whole congregation convinced and really wanting to work on this as a call, um, everything flows very smoothly, and there's a very strong program that typically will last for years.
Yeah, I concur, Bill. It is the most important thing to get congregational agreement and concurrence. And I know I don't recall Karina, our technical assistant on this, mentioning it at Lake Washington, but they had a ready-made situation when they were starting their safe parking and that they had been hosting tent cities, rotating tent cities on their property. So that congregation knew what it was like to have unsheltered people on their property. And so when it turned to cars, eventually, even though there were several changes, even in how they did that over the years through the learning of what was transpiring and what populations could be served, their conversation was there to back up the actual work. And you can't leave it to a committee. I've been part of a safe parking program at a large church in Seattle where they left it to three of us. Um, it did not work out.
That's
Um, it did not work out. And we became very burdened, frustrated, and tried not to take that out on the vehicle residents who were the innocent guests. And they did not understand why it was so hard. Of course, the other part of that program was something we'll probably talk about is there needs to be a whole pathway. You can't just park people in your lot and keep them there forever. And I suppose we'll get more into that as we go forward. But this first slide about uh, working with each other and even having that conversation internally. And I will say, not just internally, but making use of others who are near you. Like you may be making use of some other faith communities who are doing other kinds of service, and you can talk together and make it a partnership because those are the ways this works. Um,
and here we are. This is where it usually starts, the recognition of need, the recognition that there's a ministry looking for people to serve. Um, this is a sculpture which has gotten a lot of um, press over the last decade or so. I think there's several copies of it available now, from what I understand. There are a large variety of urban legends around it, to the effect that someone who has managed to import it and put it in front of their congregation and is visited by police who have been called to make a welfare check or to ask the guy who's sleeping on the bench to move on. Um, it really starts the conversation, and in many ways is a way of focusing on that need. What are you called to do? What are you called to respond to? And this is not just a Christian issue. We have a lot of words there that are transliterated from other languages, but they're from a wide variety of traditions. So around 2/3 of the entire world's population are members of the traditions that these words come from, and they all recognize the duties of those who have a little bit to respond to those who have a little less. Bill.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. I know as we've been Interfaith Task Force, we've had different traditions speak to us occasionally, and it's never been lost on me that almost all the other traditions uh, call taking care of the poor a duty. And in Christians, I haven't found anything that comes close to it that except maybe when Jesus says, "Do this." And so I count that as a duty. But the reality is that caring for the poor, and I have just heard William Barber recently for the Poor People's Campaign saying even in America, almost a third of America is poor, below the poverty level. And we have no idea how many are living in vehicles, which, often is the first place you turn when you lose your house. And faith communities, sadly, I'll just say it to us, we haven't stepped up quite as much as we can. So that's one of the reasons I'm glad you're thinking about this and considering it. One of the things that did come up earlier, and I think Karina mentioned it, is most of what I heard from faith communities is we can't do it. We're not allowed to do it. We're not allowed to use our land that way. We can't get permits, et cetera. The list is long. Well, on this slide, Bill had listed the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. There's been a long history in our country of courts and others trying to restrict what happens on faith property. In many cases, as it says there, only allowing you to worship on your property, nothing else. Nobody can sleep overnight. My joke used to be, even here in Washington State, well, I can go to church, I can listen to the sermon and fall asleep during the sermon, but I better not have anybody sleep in the church overnight. At the same time, we had youth groups sleeping overnight. Karina had mentioned the Religious Land Use and Institutional Persons Act. Basically, that tells it tells governments that they can't place a substantial burden on religious exercise, and they must have a compelling governmental interest if they're going to do anything. Usually, that's around health and safety. And even then, if they're going to permit it, they have to use the least restrictive means of furthering that interest. In a large part, contrary to what Bill started by saying, don't go out and start a safe parking tonight. Legally, you could go out and start safe parking tonight.
Absolutely.
And we don't ask you to do that because there's too many other things that violate other things that are important, like safety and the well-being of your people and the well-being of the people who are your guests. But legally, it is not an issue. And I'll tell you, I went through it with tent cities, and then I went through it with vehicles. Jurisdictions all wanted to pass their own legislation on how to stop faith communities from hosting the homeless. And that was outdoor camping, indoor camping, tiny homes, and safe parking. Here in Washington in 2019, we got a bill passed that covers all of that, but it also has an MOU option in it, memo of understanding, where you can just skip the council entirely. And we have one city and one church doing that. But it all based on Religious Land Use and Institutional Persons Act. If you Google it, you'll have long lists of jurisdictions trying to limit faith communities. And there's books out about it as well. But the point ends up being, you have the right to practice your faith. Yeah.
That's absolutely the case. And um, many, many people who are in congregations are essentially good citizens, and they want to follow the law. And they think that the law, as it's normally spoken, is the thing that they ought to turn to. And in this case, That's just a mistake. It's not a mistake because it's not what we want to do, but it is a mistake because the law doesn't apply. And there's no need for that. Many of the things that we heard in the last session are different from the perspective of a congregation. For example, insurance is a different issue. One of the interesting things, occasionally you'll come across a risk adjuster or a risk analyst at an insurance company who's scared of the idea of having unhoused people on an insured property. And if you work with the congregation, you have the conversation. One of the interesting things that they haven't really thought through is that there are all kinds of people who are unregistered, unknown, who are there all the time. There's no particular reason. We don't stop people on Sunday morning and say, or Saturday morning or Friday morning, and say, well, gosh, if you got insurance for that car, if you're coming on our lot, that doesn't normally happen, and it shouldn't. And this is
Yeah,
a
I'm
kind of
sorry
ministry.
you can't come. You're an insurance risk, right?
Yeah, you're an insurance risk. You can't park here this morning, but perhaps they'll take you in at the congregation across the street. Um, yeah,
Well, it's not funny. I'm smiling, but it's not funny. No.
no, it's not funny, but that's a reality. So starting that conversation will often break up the roadblocks that might come up early on with insurance. Many congregations I've worked with have never bothered to talk to their insurers. They've just said, we don't talk to them about the Boy Scout lock-in. We don't talk to them about this. It's just, we exercise our ministry and our policy says exercise your ministry.
And we have met congregations who did talk, and the insurance company said they wouldn't cover it. And we told the congregation, well, there's plenty of insurers, and they often found another insurer who would cover the full scope of their ministry, right?
Absolutely. We've also, in some cases, denominational administrators have mentioned to insurance companies that it's disappointing that the 100 or so congregations in this state are finding that one of their sister congregations can't rely on them.
Right,
So
right.
there are many ways to have this conversation.
Well, on the next slide, it talks about goals for the SafeLot, and I know some, or if not all, of these came up before in the earlier workshop. If you weren't there, it's still good. We have lots of, I'll call it, data and handouts and things that really describe all these needs, but mostly they would come from the questions at the bottom about what vehicle residents need, and that evolves and grows. I'm sure even at Lake Washington, I recall, and Karina can confirm, they did not have the same program set up they have set up right now. You just continue to evolve based on who's in your lot and who's in your who you're hosting, who and what their needs are. I can remember taking a head of one of the county's community services department there when there were, I think, 40 or 50 children at Lake Washington who were all waiting for the school bus. Her jaw dropped. She could not even picture how that was possible. But at the same time, seeing that many children having to live in vehicles was also alarming. So I just think that as you do this, you consider all these options. You talk to partners. And now I started by saying this, that a nonprofit chain of care. You need the providers who are going to be able to begin to look at housing, coordinated entry, or whatever it is in your state or jurisdiction, so that you're not hosting folks for 2 years, unless you absolutely have to. In other words, talk
I think
about these.
that
Go
I
ahead, Bill.
I agree with that, and I was going to add on a couple of things. One is that there's not an either or with respect to the congregation and its powers and its abilities to do things, and various kinds of providers who may very well be secular corporations of some sort. Um, we all have no problem as congregations having our space be used by the Sons of Norway for their annual banquet or by the Boy Scouts or whatever. That seems perfectly normal to us. And yet, when we think that perhaps the house of care might come in and operate a parking program on our parking lot as an extension of our ministry, we become somehow uncertain as to whether that's legitimate ministry. That is legitimate ministry. That's how we get the work done. So think in terms of how can you cast the biggest blanket. One of the things that we think about when we start to think about creating these kinds of programs, whatever they're going to be, whether they're people sleeping in your dining hall or they're people sleeping in their cars on your parking lot or in tents in your playground, there could be a whole lot of things going on. But one of the first things to think about, we would normally say, and that's what we heard in the last program, it's about creating safety and creating sanitation and hygiene. Yes, yes, that's true. But because we're congregations, one of the first things to think about, and one of the most important, is about offering the opportunities of belonging, being seen, being heard, and the intention of building community among those who are coming in with those who are hosting. It's not just about they can come aboard, it's we welcome them among we. And does that mean we go out and have services? No, I can't imagine that actually. And I've only ever had one congregation that thought it was a great idea to hold some sort of service, and their program only lasted for a couple of months. And then strangely enough, the congregants started wandering away and it sort of fell apart. As a general rule, there are a good many pastors who will say, you know, today is this particular important day in our tradition. Um, after dinner hour, is it okay if I just pass the word that I'm available for those who want to reflect with me on this day? Great. Works well. It's a good way of increasing the intention of community. But we don't really see this as this is a way to fill our pews with newly minted members. That's not the intention here. The intention here is to create community, to spread love, to create relationship.
Yeah, we're facing here in King County a city where 30 religiously oriented groups, most congregations are wanting to do something about homelessness. And after the first meeting, about 80% of what was said was building a relationship with Jesus. Well, that's fine and good. It's just it's not going to be the first step. It can be offered early on, but at the same time, you kind of have to get out of the way of proselytizing and feed and house and clothe and make it safe and all these other very important things that we forget as people living in houses we have automatically almost. It's very hard for congregants to put themselves into the role of what it's like to be homeless and just not understand that almost everything they have is something they should give thanks for every single day, every single minute of the day. I take a shower and I am almost praising God in the shower because it is such a blessing to have a shower.
It is indeed. And one of the really cool things that happens is that we can go beyond the satisfying the basic needs. In the
Oh, sure.
last program, Graham mentioned for a few minutes Maslow's hierarchy. They talked about the fact that until we have some basic needs in place, safety, sanitation, hygiene, food, people can't even respond to other needs. They can know that they are loved, but that's about the extent of it. Once we go beyond getting the basic needs out of the way, what do we do? What do we do? And if we can recognize people, we do most of what we need to do. One of the people that I remember well, she came to us ill, but she didn't know why. Turned out to be something that would take her life within a couple of years.
Mhm.
And She was an engaging person. We helped her to stabilize her life and to find a place to live and so forth. And while she was at it, she joined not the congregation that had offered her that space, but a nearby congregation that she had wandered into one Sunday morning while out walking around. And she became a really, really good member there. In the first year of the COVID shutdown, she passed away of the disease that she had. And interestingly enough, it was the first in our community, it was the first time that there had been a funeral held on Zoom. And the head of the congregation, the elected head of the congregation board, was the person who spoke her eulogy. That's a remarkable transformation for someone who had spent 40 years living in abandoned trailers in the mountains outside of town.
Mhm.
And that's where that can lead, but it's not the intention of the program to create members. It's the intention of the program to bring people together, and that means not having people who are willing to hide behind an apron to dispense food.
Yeah, yeah.
Our training for volunteers begins as follows. Don't come here expecting to put on an apron and go to work. That's not what we're asking you to do. What we would like you to do is come in, sit down next to someone, introduce yourself, and listen to their story. After you've done that a few times, you may see some things that you understand you could help with. Great. We'll find a way to make that all work, but you'll want to continue your conversations because you've met so many new friends. And that's really how we try to work people through our programs.
Yeah, and that's perfect, Bill. The term we use out here is accompaniment and companionship, but all based on coming and listening. I sometimes use the very descriptive phrase, "Don't let your monkey brain get in the way," because we want to cure things and solve things. And oh, I know somebody who can get you a job tomorrow, or I can get you a new car. I mean, those are all the wrong things to bring.
Right.
It may be there's a point someplace down the road where someone asks, and they kind of charge you with being the link to other things. But if you're not charged to be the link, don't be the link, because you'll be more like a millstone, and it's that capacity inside of each person that we are rebuilding. Because when anyone has been homeless, that self integrity, that capacity that they can do things needs to be rebuilt and reestablished and affirmed. And it may not even be that folks are going to do it the same way we do it, but that's where this gets spiritual. I'll say it that way, is building back the inner divine self, or whatever you want to call that, the trust in oneself. So their intention of community needs to be party to this. Doesn't need to be formal. It can be very informal. It can be humorous. One colleague who used to do outreach with us was always using sometimes even the worst kind of humor, um, putting his foot in his mouth. But the humor was what ingratiated him to the people who could say, well, this guy seems like me, you know? And it wasn't always perfect, but at the same time, he knew that he was about building a relationship with those that he was out there with, and that he was no better, really. No better, just in a different place. Um, and these are things that congregations don't tend to teach its members. Um, Even in seminary, I can recall not being taught so much of what I've learned out here, um, and especially getting onto the street. So the last thing, have you asked some vehicle residents? If you go to a soup kitchen, sit with them, exactly as Bill said. If they come in new, they're going to have ideas that the program didn't think of, and that sometimes we can actually kind of go, "Oh, I hadn't thought of that."
Yeah. In fact,
Keep those phrases in mind. I hadn't thought of that.
that's right. Most of us think that if we have a committee sitting in around a table in the dining hall, we can design the program that needs to be designed because, we know what needs to be done.
Yeah,
Um, Always, not even at the beginning and in the middle and all the way through all the time, ask your guests, what's going on and what do you need?
And even if it's something that you're going to say, we can't do that, add the word at the end, we can't do that alone. In other words, we're going to have to help you find that pathway.
That's
And
right.
because there's not much that can't happen. I know in our fledgling, we're kind of holding on by a string in a vehicle residency work group for our county. But one of the folks is living disabled in her van, and she is so capable. And she said, I want on the list disabled parking programs. And I can't think of anybody who's done one of those in our county. And oh, we got a hand. That's good. I think at some point soon we're going to just turn this completely over to
Well, I think
questions.
so. Why don't we look ahead and see what well, we're just going to say, I'm not even going to spend time looking at all this small print. I just want you to know that there are services that have lots of small print, and here's what they look like. You'll be
Yeah.
able to get these slides after the program, and you'll be able to see this recording after the program. So there are handbooks,
And
there are
also
websites. There you
this is a
go.
this is a giant folder pretty much telling you how to do it. If you want to email Graham, he'll be sure I get news of it and I can even send it to you. We have an e-version, it doesn't work quite as well, but
Although I've got your e-version, Bill, and I didn't have that much trouble decoding it. It
well
works well for me.
it's kind of like an IKEA instruction book in a way.
That was my exact impression.
But you still always have to take everything that we get with a grain of salt and talk to others and especially talk to the guests. Yeah.
So we have three questions. Karina, do you want to read the questions to us, or do you want us to go ahead and read them?
You go ahead and read them.
Oh,
Sounds
I
good.
should get the chat.
So the first one that came in is faith-based implies there is a religious expectation or structure. What are the religious or faith-based expectations? What does it look like for the resident and for the provider? Well, I think that was a lot of our conversation. And this was an early question, so maybe it's already been partially answered. But for one, would say that the religious expectation is that religiosity has no place in this. Bill, do you have a thought?
I always go to in the Christian tradition, the greatest commandment, part of it's love God. I don't need to hear about how people have a personal or private relationship with God, but I do want them to care for others as they care for themselves. You know, bring up that sort of relationship of respect, and that is, you know, you can call it golden rule, whatever you want to call it, but in other words, this is not a city lot someplace where you're all on your own. The intention of community is what we're about here, caring for and looking out for each other. Um, and some won't want that. You know, they're free to turn away and say, I don't want that. I want something very private and I want to be hidden. Um, that probably doesn't work at most faith-based lots. Yeah.
Bill, do you want to read question two?
Let me scroll down and see what it says. Question two. I'm not part of a particular congregation, but know a few in my town who do this kind of outreach. Who do this? Oh, in my town, who do this kind of outreach and have for some time. The Interfaith Council has had a showers lunch program for 15 years, but not at church sites. Several others have warming shelters in the winter. One is even trying to build tiny homes, but they are all afraid to do safe parking programs. I guess because of how it intersects with the police and the surrounding neighbors. How do we help change that? Well, sometimes my curt response is it's your property and you are free to use it as you wish. And what I often say too, I'll stop very briefly. Sometimes the faith community has been there 45 years and the neighborhood built around it hasn't. In other words, the faith community is often the long-term neighbor for the public good. That's often what I call faith communities. And the safe parking programs require a conversation with the public sector, partly about our LUPA, but also about how they run their laws for the streets and their parking and everything else. That can get a little bit more complicated, but the permission, they don't have, it's not their permission to do this. That doesn't exist for the city. All they can really end up doing is health and safety. In other words, compelling governmental interest, if they're trying to bring in some reason why you can't do safe parking, and it's not that there's no reasons, it's just that they can't just edict that you can't do safe parking. I don't know, is there more intelligence, Bill, that you want to bring to that rude
I would just,
response?
just anecdotally, I would say one of the interesting things that we have always done in many of the programs that I've run, I think 30 out of 40 of the congregations we worked with, is when we open each evening at, sundown, we call the local 911 dispatch number and say, we just opened here and this is what we're doing tonight.
Yeah,
And if you guys want to swing by a couple of times just to keep an eye on, fine, thank you. And by the
yeah,
way, we don't have any front end paperwork. So if you have a problem you need to solve, you can drop by.
yeah. We always had officers that patrol a certain area, whether it's an outdoor camp or safe parking, come and get acquainted and tell them what the permissions and the non-permissions are and things like that. Yes, make friends with public safety, and they usually appreciate it, um, for sure.
They especially like the part about no paperwork. It's not like a detox center where it's going to take you an hour and 6 forms to get someone out of your back seat and into the program.
So you can all tell Bill's a lawyer. That's all kicking in now. Very good. So the next question is, what are some of the concerns commonly brought up from the congregation and leadership? How do you overcome those challenges? Well, I will just quickly say anything that can go wrong, they're worried about. Yeah,
Yeah.
anything.
And
And that there's gonna and in some cases that it's gonna fall on their shoulders.
in
Um,
prayer and discernment talk, those kinds of things are those are the mainstays of getting through that.
Yeah, I think when it's too narrow, as I mentioned, happened at the church to where it didn't work for us, where it was all on the shoulders of 2 or 3 people. And even though we had our own personal capacity and power and didn't want to take no for an answer, it overwhelmed us because too many things required partnerships that the whole congregation could provide. Even though there were 2 showers inside the building, the church was worried about our people using the showers. So, I mean, that's the kind of things that congregational leaders can get very unreasonable about in terms of just having a little bit too much fear rather than thinking about, well, that we could get a woman to accompany a woman inside and make sure that everything goes well for her inside and then come back out. There's a remedy for almost everything, and almost all of it comes out of a relationship, forming a relationship that works mutually. So I think it, and Bill referred to this, I think when everybody tries to go too fast too soon, and doesn't have some of the answers, and I won't even say answers as permanent answers, but pathways addressed, that's when things can go awry. But even when they go wrong, you learn. I mean, I think Lake Washington uh, did a lot of things that it wouldn't have done uh, again, and it learned. It just and now they're I'll call them all stars, but I don't really want to ever call anybody all stars for hosting the homeless because it's such a burden and a millstone around all of us as a society that we have so many homeless people.
another interesting anecdote. This was a few years ago. One of a congregation we were working with um, started up a program. And there had been a core group that had been very interested in going forward, and they had led the discernment process. And they undertook that they would be the ones to make sure that the lot was cleaned up and the signs were put up in the early evening, and that in the morning that was all taken in and so forth. But interestingly enough, they would melt away when the guests were there. And the
Mm,
choir, which was like many choirs, a seat of thought about not changing things very much, had been very concerned because they rehearsed at night and they were not certain at all what it would be like to have a choir rehearsal with strangers parked in the parking lot, although that didn't seem to bother them when it was Bridge Club night. But in any event, um, after a while, they got talking among themselves, and I think it was about maybe 4 months into the program on one Wednesday night, they asked if they could come out and sing a concert. And they did. They came out for about 15 minutes and they sang a little concert and they were well received. And after that, they started coming a little early and they would form up and they would warm up by singing a song before they went into to their practice. And they got to know the people who were parking much more than the people who had originally sponsored the program. And they became the essentially the congregational champions of the program.
Hmm. Yeah, many surprises, right? Uh, One question about the discernment process. There's one thing that's available, and I mentioned accompaniment. Um, if you can find others who are doing this and will be in conversation with you, um, that's both assuring and also can be very innovative because of what's unique. And now that we have this beast called Zoom or whatever, Microsoft Teams or whatever one you want to use, there's more opportunities to be accompanied. I mean, if I want to start, I could call up Bill Sweeney and say, hey, can you accompany our discernment team for
Mhm.
4 weeks, one night a week for maybe 20 minutes while we hash things out or whatever it is? We didn't used to have that. And it always had to be more in person. I mean, I've done that around King County, gone to so many in-person meetings to help people get their safe parking started. But even as much as I often dislike Zoom, it's a great tool that no matter where you are in this country, if you can attach to the National Vehicle Residency Summit or collective, you can probably be put in touch with someone who can accompany you in some of these initial steps. Um, but I often, you know, I don't think doing it on our own is of much value for any of us who have not got someone who's done it before. Um,
I think that's wise advice. Now we're running out of time and we've had three questions on the subject of insurance.
uh,
So we did mention briefly that by and large, and as um, Graham said at the end of the prior program, insurance may be a non-issue, but in any event, it's a scary thing to contemplate, and we're all quite certain that we need insurance and that this is something that needs the attention of an insurer. Ordinary insurance brokers, commercial insurance brokers, can be quite helpful in locating insurance companies that are interested in doing business with congregations. Um, the internet can be helpful. Search for things that involve both insurance and church. Church Insurance Corporation comes to mind. It's not the only one with a name like that. Some of them are linked to denominations, and they'll be clear about that. If you're not part of the this dispensation of the Southern Baptist Church, we're not interested in offering a policy. Well, we get that. So there are a variety of things that may be worth considering there, but it is relatively easy to find an insurer. More to the point, though, you really should talk, especially if you have a lawyer in your congregation or someone who does risk management for a corporation as a job. You really should talk about how do we manage the insurance relationship, because it turns out that this is really not a concern for your insurer, just like under the law, it's not really a concern for your county land use operation.
mhm. Absolutely. Yeah. They're always worried about risk and anything different they count as risk. But you have the same risk every week that you're inviting strangers onto your property for worship, or if you're doing a bake sale or any other kind of event, a jubilee. Sometimes you have to get a rider for some of those kinds of things, a unique one-time event. But when it comes to the practice of your ministry, of your faith, even that's where a lupa comes in handy. It's describing that as core to who you are as a people on that property and in that place. And it's good to convince yourselves of that. It's very hard to want to stand up and be identified as a person of faith sometimes in our communities these days. But collectively, you're a good neighbor. I mean, I always like defaulting to that. You're a good neighbor and you care for the poor. And some think the city should be doing all of it. I think the city should do more of it. But sometimes your witness is going to spur the city to do more. Um, and I think I don't offer it this way, but you will get a reward back that you can't measure in your own sense of who you are as a person. and what you value. And if you have children or others, or if they're a youth, it's a very contagious thing that starts to happen. I think I've watched that at Lake Washington and other local congregations. People will burn out. My experience is people burn out when they don't listen and they try to do too much. So spend more time listening. That really does cure burnout. Just say, I can't do those potatoes another week. I have to go sit with the guests.
There's nothing more that I'd like to do.
I
And then
know.
finally, I think we have one we can quickly get to here. It says a lot has a rule someone knows about that there's no couples or children. Well, that could be. Whatever you want to do, those are your rules. If you want to allow households that include children into your lot,
Yeah.
free. The best thing to do is if you have households with children who are living in vehicles, ask them what they need in a lot and see if you can work out a way to do what they need with your lot and your resources.
Yeah, that's where some regional conversation comes in handy. Um, yes, you can't serve everybody.
And by the way, the school bus thing is real. There is a program. There is a program in every school district in the United States that says that people who are unhoused have to still get their kids to school, and the school bus will call on them. So know that that resource exists.
Yes. And thanks to all of you who came. I think it says our time is up.